The milk splashed across the wooden floor, white droplets spattering Elizabeth Granger's worn boots as the pitcher shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. Time seemed to slow as she watched the last of the morning's milk seep into the floorboards, her heart plummeting with it. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching from behind made her blood run cold. "You worthless, clumsy girl." Samuel Granger's voice boomed through the small farmhouse kitchen. That was the last of the milk until market day. Elizabeth turned, her eyes wide with fear, already backing away. "I'm sorry, Father." My hand slipped. The first blow caught her across the cheek, sending her stumbling against the counter. At 21, Elizabeth had endured her father's rages for as long as she could remember, but they had worsened since her mother's death 3 winters ago. Her father's grief had twisted into something cruel, something that seemed to find fault with everything she did. "Sorry doesn't feed us," he snarled, grabbing her arm with fingers that would leave bruises by nightfall. "Sorry doesn't replace what we can't afford." Elizabeth didn't cry out as he struck her again. She had learned long ago that tears only fueled his anger. Instead, she made herself small, protecting her face with her arms as she'd done countless times before. "Clean this mess up," he spat, finally releasing her. "And don't expect any breakfast. Maybe hunger will teach you to be more careful." As the front doors slammed behind him, Elizabeth sank to her knees beside the shattered pitcher, her hands trembling as she began to gather the broken pieces. A single tear escaped, dropping onto a shard of white ceramic. Her reflection stared back at her, distorted in the pooled milk-pale face, auburn hair, and now the beginning of what would become a dark bruise along her cheekbone. This was Willow Creek, Montana Territory, 1879. To the rest of the small frontier town, Samuel Granger was a hard-working widower who had fallen on difficult times. No one saw what happened behind closed doors. No one knew the fear that defined Elizabeth's existence. No one would believe that the quiet, church-going man could be so cruel to his only daughter. Elizabeth had nowhere to go, no money of her own, and no family to turn to. Her father had made certain of that, keeping her isolated on their struggling farm miles from town, allowing her into Willow Creek only for Sunday services or occasional supply runs where he never let her out of his sight. As she cleaned the kitchen floor, Elizabeth's mind drifted to the stories her mother used to tell her of faraway places: San Francisco with its grand buildings, New York City with streets teeming with people, places where a woman might disappear and start anew. But those were just dreams, as insubstantial as morning mist. Reality was the farm, her father's temper, and the endless cycle of work that never seemed to satisfy him. By noon, the heat had become oppressive, the summer sun beating down on the small farmhouse. Elizabeth wiped sweat from her brow as she hung laundry on the line, wincing as she stretched her arm. Fresh bruises were forming beneath her sleeve, joining older ones that had yet to fade completely. "Miss Granger," the deep voice startled her, and she whirled around, heart pounding. A tall figure on horseback had approached without her noticing, the dust from the road clinging to his boots and the brim of his hat pulled low against the sun. "I'm sorry to frighten you, madam." The man tipped his hat back, revealing a face Elizabeth recognized from town: Randall Xavier, who had taken over the old Murphy ranch last spring. She had seen him occasionally at church or at the general store, though they'd never spoken. "Mr. Xavier," she acknowledged, unconsciously turning her bruised cheek away from his view. "My father isn't here. He's gone to check the north pasture." Randall Xavier dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. He was younger than she'd thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. "Actually, Miss Granger, I came to speak with you." He kept a respectful distance, seeming to sense her unease. "Your father mentioned at the meeting last week that you might be willing to sell some of your preserves. My cook quit unexpectedly, and I've got 3 ranch hands who are about ready to revolt over my attempts at feeding them." Elizabeth hesitated. Her father had said no such thing. In fact, he guarded her preserves jealously, allowing her to sell only what he deemed excess at the harvest festival each fall. But the opportunity to earn even a small amount of money was tempting. I'm not sure what my father would say," she admitted, unconsciously touching her bruised arm. Randall's eyes narrowed slightly, and Elizabeth realized too late that her sleeve had slipped, revealing the darkening marks on her pale skin. She quickly tugged the fabric down, but the damage was done. His expression shifted, something like understanding passing across his features. "Miss Granger," he said quietly, "that's quite a bruise on your cheek." Elizabeth turned away, busying herself with the laundry. "I'm clumsy. Walked into the door this morning." "And your arm?" "Another door." Her hands stilled on the damp sheet. "Mr. Xavier, I appreciate your concern, but Elizabeth." Her father's voice carried from the edge of the property where he'd appeared on horseback. Elizabeth's stomach twisted with dread as he rode toward them, his expression thunderous. "What's going on here?" Samuel demanded as he dismounted, eyes darting between his daughter and Randall. Randall touched his hat politely. "Afternoon, Granger. I was just asking your daughter about purchasing some preserves." Samuel's gaze settled on Elizabeth, suspicion evident. "Is that so? Strange you'd come all this way when we'll be bringing goods to the Harvest Festival in a few weeks." "My men are threatening mutiny over my cooking," Randall said easily, though Elizabeth noted how he'd positioned himself slightly between her and her father. "Thought I might speed things along." Samuel grunted. "We've nothing to spare at present. Times are hard." "I understand. Perhaps another time." Randall turned to Elizabeth, his eyes communicating something she couldn't quite decipher. "Good day, Miss Granger." As he rode away, Elizabeth felt an inexplicable sense of loss, as though a brief window to another world had opened and closed too quickly for her to glimpse what lay beyond. That night, as she prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, her father watched her with unusual intensity from his seat at the table. "What did Xavier really want?" he demanded suddenly. Elizabeth kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring. "Just what he said. Preserves for his men." "Don't lie to me, girl. Men like Xavier don't ride all this way for preserves." "He was looking at you." "No, father, he—" The back of Samuel's hand caught her across her already bruised cheek, sending her stumbling against the stove. The pot of beans clattered to the floor, spilling its contents across the clean boards. "See what you've done now," he roared, rising from his chair. "Wasting good food when we can barely afford seed for next season." Elizabeth backed away, but there was nowhere to go in the small kitchen. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it." His hand closed around her throat, pushing her against the wall. "You're just like your mother. Always drawing men's eyes. Always thinking you're too good for this place." "Please," she gasped, struggling for breath as his fingers tightened. Something shifted in his eyes, then a moment of recognition, perhaps, of what he was doing, and he released her suddenly. Elizabeth slid to the floor, coughing and clutching her throat. "Clean this mess," he muttered, grabbing his coat. "I'm going to town." When the door slammed behind him, Elizabeth knew he would return late, reeking of whiskey from the saloon. Those nights were often the worst. With shaking hands, she cleaned the spilled beans, salvaging what she could. As she worked, a decision crystallized in her mind, born of desperation and the small seed of hope that Randall Xavier's unexpected visit had planted. She would leave tonight. While her father drank away his anger in town, she would take what little she could carry and go. Somewhere. Anywhere but here. By moonlight, Elizabeth packed a small bundle, a change of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, the few coins she'd managed to hide away over the years. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She penned a brief note, knowing it would only fuel her father's rage, but unable to simply vanish without a word. As she slipped out the back door into the cool night air, Elizabeth felt a curious mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had never defied her father like this before. The consequences would be severe if he found her, but for the first time in years, she felt something like hope flickering in her chest. The road to town stretched before her, silver in the moonlight. She would have to be careful. Willow Creek was small, and someone would surely recognize her. Perhaps she could make it to the stage depot before dawn and be on the morning coach before her father discovered her absence. Elizabeth had walked perhaps a mile when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Panicking, she darted off the road into the shadows of the trees, heart pounding as she crouched behind a fallen log. If it was her father returning early. The rider slowed as he approached her hiding place, and with a jolt of fear, Elizabeth realized he must have seen her. She pressed herself lower to the ground, willing herself to become invisible in the darkness. "Miss Granger." The voice wasn't her father's, but Randall Xavier's. Elizabeth remained frozen, uncertain whether to reveal herself or stay hidden. "Elizabeth," he called again, softer this time. "I know you're there. I saw you leave the farm." Slowly, she rose from her hiding place, clutching her small bundle to her chest. "Mr. Xavier, what are you doing here?" In the moonlight, his expression was grave. "I came to check on you. After I saw those bruises today, I couldn't stop thinking about it." "You were watching the farm?" she asked, suddenly wary. He dismounted, keeping a respectful distance. "Not exactly. I was on my way back from town when I saw your father ride in alone. Something didn't sit right." He gestured to her bundle. "You're running away." It wasn't a question. Elizabeth lifted her chin defiantly. "I can't stay. Not anymore." "Where will you go?" I don't know." The admission hung between them, highlighting the desperation of her plan. Randall took a step closer, his expression softening. "Elizabeth, you can't just wander off in the night with nowhere to go. This territory isn't kind to a woman alone." "I'll manage," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Let me help you," he said quietly. "My ranch has a small cabin for the foreman, but it's empty just now. You could stay there, at least until you figure out your next move. No one would think to look for you there." Elizabeth studied him in the moonlight, trying to discern his intentions. She had been taught to be wary of men offering help, that such assistance always came with a price. Yet something in Randall Xavier's steady gaze made her want to trust him. "Why would you help me? You barely know me." His eyes drifted to the bruise on her cheek, visible even in the dim light. "No one deserves to live in fear, Elizabeth. No one deserves bruises for spilling milk or speaking to a neighbor." He extended his hand, not quite touching her. "Come with me. No more bruises. I promise you that." The simplicity of those words, "no more bruises," struck Elizabeth with unexpected force. 3 small words that offered what she had wanted for so long: safety. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "All right." Randall helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her. As they rode away from the road toward his ranch, Elizabeth felt a strange mix of terror and relief. She was leaving everything she had ever known, placing her trust in a virtual stranger. Yet with each hoofbeat carrying her farther from her father's house, the tightness in her chest eased just a little. The Xavier Ranch sprawled across a picturesque valley with mountains rising in the distance. Even in the darkness, Elizabeth could see it was substantially larger than her father's modest farm. A main house stood silhouetted against the night sky, with several outbuildings nearby. Randall guided his horse toward a small cabin set apart from the other structures. "This is the foreman's cabin," he explained as they dismounted. "Like I said, it's empty right now. You'll have privacy here." He lit a lamp, illuminating a simple but clean interior: a bed, a small table with chairs, a wood stove, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. It was modest, but far more peaceful than the home she had fled. "There's food in the cupboard," Randall said, setting the lamp on the table. "Fresh water in the pitcher. Lock the door behind me, and don't worry about anyone disturbing you. My men live in the bunkhouse on the other side of the property, and they mind their own business." Elizabeth set her small bundle on the table, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what she had done. "Mr. Xavier, Randall," he corrected gently. "Randall," she repeated, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. "I don't know how to thank you." "There's no need. Get some rest. We can talk more tomorrow about what happens next." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Elizabeth, I meant what I said. You're safe here. No more bruises." After he left, Elizabeth secured the door as instructed and stood in the middle of the small cabin, hardly daring to believe the turn her life had taken in a single night. For the first time in years, she would sleep without fear of what morning might bring. Dawn broke clear and golden over the Xavier Ranch, sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window to wake Elizabeth from the deepest sleep she'd had in years. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings triggering a flash of panic before memory returned. She was free, for now at least. Rising from the bed, Elizabeth washed her face in the basin, wincing as her fingers brushed the bruise on her cheek. Her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand was a stark reminder of what she had left behind and what might still await her if her father found her. Samuel Granger would not let her go easily. Of that, she was certain. A knock at the door startled her from these dark thoughts. Cautiously, she approached, calling out, "Who is it?" "It's Randall. I've brought breakfast." Elizabeth opened the door to find him holding a tray laden with eggs, bacon, and biscuits, the scent making her stomach growl embarrassingly. She realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager lunch. "Good morning," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with concern. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," she admitted, stepping aside to let him enter. "You didn't need to bring me food. Figured you might be hungry." He set the tray on the table. "And I wanted to check on you. Make sure you're settling in all right." Elizabeth sat across from him, uncertain of the protocol in this situation. Should she serve him? Wait for him to leave before eating? Her father had strict rules about meal times, and breaking them often resulted in a backhand across the face. Seeming to sense her discomfort, Randall pushed the plate toward her. "Go ahead. I've already eaten with the men." She took a small bite of the eggs, then another, hunger overcoming her hesitation. "This is delicious. My cook may have quit, but I did convince Mrs. Holloway from town to come by 3 days a week to prepare meals. Today's one of those blessed days." He smiled, and Elizabeth was struck by how it transformed his face, softening the weathered lines around his eyes. "Your father will be looking for you," he said after a moment, his expression growing serious. "Word travels fast in Willow Creek." Elizabeth set down her fork, appetite suddenly diminished. "I know. He'll be furious. I've sent 2 of my men to town on errands. They'll let us know if there's talk or trouble." Randall studied her across the table. "Elizabeth, I need to ask, has he done this often? The bruises?" She looked away, shame washing over her despite knowing she had nothing to be ashamed of. "For as long as I can remember, but worse since Mother died. He drinks, and then he finds fault with everything I do. And no one in town ever noticed? Or said anything? He's careful. The bruises are usually where clothing covers them." She touched her cheek. "This was careless of him. He's never marked my face before." Randall's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "You don't have to go back. Ever. I want you to know that." Hope flickered in Elizabeth's chest, but reality quickly dampened it. "He won't just let me go? And I have nowhere else to go. No money." "No, you have options," Randall interrupted. "More than you might think. But first, you need time to rest and heal. Stay here as long as you need to. Think about what you want for your future." The concept was so foreign having choices, considering her own wants, that Elizabeth found herself momentarily speechless. Her entire life had been dictated by her father's demands and temper. "Thank you," she finally managed. "For everything." After breakfast, Randall showed her around the immediate area, pointing out the path to the main house, the small creek that ran behind the cabin, and the vegetable garden she was welcome to use. Elizabeth was struck by the peaceful beauty of the ranch, so different from the tension-filled atmosphere of her father's farm. "I need to see to some business in the north pasture," Randall said as they walked back to the cabin. "Will you be all right here alone for a few hours?" "Of course," Elizabeth assured him. "I'm used to being alone." Something in her tone made him pause, studying her with those piercing blue eyes. "That's a shame," he said quietly. "You strike me as someone who deserves good company." Before she could formulate a response to such an unexpected compliment, he tipped his hat and strode toward the barn, leaving Elizabeth with a curious warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the summer sun. Inside the cabin, Elizabeth found herself at loose ends. She had spent her entire life working, cooking, cleaning, tending gardens, mending clothes, with barely a moment for idle thoughts. Now, with nothing demanding her immediate attention, she felt strangely adrift. She decided to make herself useful by thoroughly cleaning the already tidy cabin. It was a familiar task, one that required no thought but kept her hands busy. As she worked, she allowed herself to imagine, for the first time, a life beyond her father's control. Perhaps she could find work in a larger town, or even travel to one of the cities her mother had told her about. These pleasant daydreams were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses in the early afternoon. Elizabeth froze, the broom still in her hands, as voices became audible outside. "Xavier, I know you're harboring my daughter. Show yourself." Her father's voice, slurred with what was likely whiskey despite the early hour, sent ice through her veins. Elizabeth backed away from the window, heart pounding. More voices joined the commotion, Randall's calm tones contrasting sharply with her father's bellowing. Though she couldn't make out the words, The confrontation was clearly escalating. Against her better judgment, Elizabeth cracked the cabin door open just enough to peer outside. What she saw made her blood run cold. Her father, red-faced and swaying slightly in his saddle, was facing off against Randall, who stood with his back to the cabin. Two of Randall's ranch hands flanked him, while the town sheriff, looking distinctly uncomfortable, sat on his horse to one side. "I demand to see my daughter," Samuel Granger shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at Randall. "She's my property, and you've stolen her away." "No woman is property, Granger," Randall replied, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "And I haven't stolen anyone." "Sheriff," Samuel appealed to the lawman, "you know a father has rights. This man has taken my only child, interfered in family matters." Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Samuel, let's not make accusations without proof. Xavier here says he hasn't seen Elizabeth. He's lying. Where else would she go? She has no friends, no money. And whose fault is that?" Randall's voice remained level, but Elizabeth could hear the undercurrent of anger. "Perhaps if you treated her like a daughter instead of a punching bag, she wouldn't have run." Samuel's face darkened dangerously. "You dare accuse me? In front of the sheriff, no less." "I'm just stating facts, Granger. Facts that the good people of Willow Creek have chosen to ignore for too long." Randall took a step forward. "I saw the bruises. Fresh ones on her face and arms. How do you explain those?" Elizabeth held her breath as the sheriff turned his attention fully to her father, seeming to notice something for the first time. "Samuel, is there truth to this? Have you been laying hands on that girl?" "She's clumsy," Samuel snapped. "Always has been. Tripping, dropping things, and I suppose she tripped into your fist yesterday when I saw those fresh bruises." Randall challenged. A tense silence fell over the group. Then Samuel's hand moved to the pistol at his hip. "I won't stand for these lies. Tell me where my daughter is, or by God, you'll what?" Randall didn't reach for his own weapon, but his stance shifted subtly. "Shoot me in front of the sheriff? Add murder to your list of crimes." For a moment, Elizabeth thought her father might actually draw his gun. Then Sheriff Miller intervened, urging his horse between the two men. "That's enough. Samuel, take your hand off that pistol right now, or I'll arrest you myself." The sheriff's voice carried the full authority of his office. "I came along today as a courtesy, but I won't stand by and watch you threaten a man on his own property." Samuel's hand slowly moved away from his gun, but his eyes remained fixed on Randall with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Xavier. Not by a long shot. For your sake, Granger, I hope it is," Randall replied. "Go home, sober up, and think hard about what kind of man you've become." With a final venomous glare, Samuel wheeled his horse around and galloped away, kicking up dust that lingered long after he disappeared from view. The sheriff remained behind, regarding Randall with a mixture of suspicion and respect. "Level with me, Xavier. Is the Granger girl here?" Elizabeth held her breath, pressing herself against the cabin wall, out of sight of the window. "Sheriff, if Elizabeth Granger has fled her father's abuse and found sanctuary somewhere, would you really force her back to that house?" Randall's question hung in the air, a direct challenge. After a long moment, Sheriff Miller sighed heavily. "I've known Samuel since we were boys. Never thought him capable of. But then, grief changes a man. Grief explains. It doesn't excuse." "No, it doesn't." The sheriff adjusted his hat. "I didn't see any young woman here today. But Xavier, if you are helping her, make sure she knows she can come to my office if she needs protection. The law does have provisions for cases of domestic difficulty." With that, he tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Randall standing in the yard with his ranch hands. Elizabeth closed the cabin door silently, sliding down against it until she sat on the floor, knees drawn to her chest. She had never heard anyone stand up to her father like that, never imagined anyone would take her side against him. The sheriff's words replayed in her mind the law might actually protect her. The concept was so foreign she could hardly grasp it. A soft knock at the door startled her from these thoughts. "Elizabeth? It's Randall. They're gone." She stood shakily and opened the door. Randall stood there, concern etched on his features. "You heard?" he asked. Elizabeth nodded, unable to find words for the tumult of emotions coursing through her. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," he said, stepping inside when she moved aside. Your father didn't see you, did he? No, she managed. Randall, what you did. No one has ever. To her horror, tears welled in her eyes, and despite her best efforts to contain them, they spilled down her cheeks. A lifetime of suppressed emotion seemed to break free all at once. Without hesitation, Randall closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her in a gentle embrace. It's all right. You're safe. Elizabeth stiffened initially, unaccustomed to such contact that didn't bring pain. Then, gradually, she relaxed against him, allowing herself to accept the comfort he offered. His shirt grew damp with her tears, but he didn't pull away, just held her steady as years of fear and pain poured out of her. When her tears finally subsided, embarrassment took their place. She stepped back, wiping her face with trembling hands. I'm sorry. I don't usually. I never cry in front of. Don't apologize, Randall said, his voice gentle. After what you've been through, you're entitled to a few tears. Elizabeth managed a watery smile. The sheriff. He seemed to believe you. Miller's a good man, despite his friendship with your father. I think he suspected something wasn't right for some time. Randall moved to the small stove, filling the kettle with water. Tea might help. As he busied himself with this simple, domestic task, Elizabeth watched him with growing curiosity. Randall Xavier was unlike any man she had ever known. He moved with confidence, but no aggression, spoke plainly, but never cruelly, and seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being without any obvious ulterior motive. Why are you doing this? She asked suddenly. Taking such a risk for someone you barely know? Randall paused in his tea preparation, considering her question seriously. When I was a boy, he finally said, my mother suffered much as you have. My father's temper was legendary in our town, but no one intervened. Not the sheriff, not the preacher, not our neighbors. They all looked the other way. His hands clenched briefly on the countertop. She died when I was 12. Fall down the stairs, they said. Accident. You don't believe it was, Elizabeth said softly. I know it wasn't. His blue eyes met hers, haunted by old pain. I promised myself then that I would never be like those townspeople who saw and did nothing. Never be the man who looks away from suffering he could prevent. The simple honesty of his explanation touched something deep within Elizabeth. I'm sorry about your mother. It was a long time ago. Randall handed her a cup of tea, but it shaped who I am. When I saw those bruises yesterday, I couldn't just ride away and forget. They sat at the small table, a comfortable silence falling between them as they sipped their tea. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed plaintively. What happens now? Elizabeth finally asked, voicing the question that had been troubling her since her impulsive flight. That depends on what you want, Randall replied. You could stay here as long as needed. The cabin is yours. Or if you prefer to go elsewhere, I can arrange safe passage to Helena or even further. You have choices, Elizabeth. Choices. There was that word again, so simple, yet so profound for someone who had never been allowed to make her own decisions. I don't know what I want, she admitted. I've never been permitted to want anything. Something flashed in Randall's eyes, anger, perhaps, but not directed at her. Then that's where you start. Figuring out what Elizabeth Granger wants from life, not what Samuel Granger demands of her. The concept was both terrifying and exhilarating. I think I'd like to stay. For now, at least. If that's truly all right with you. More than all right, he assured her, and the warmth in his smile made Elizabeth wonder if perhaps she did know one thing she wanted after all. The days that followed took on a rhythm unlike anything Elizabeth had experienced before. She woke each morning not to her father's demands, but to birdsong and the distant sounds of ranch life. No one rushed her, berated her, or made her feel less than. For the first time in her memory, she could breathe without the constant tightness of anxiety in her chest. Randall checked on her daily, but never intruded. He brought books from his personal library when he learned she enjoyed reading, fresh vegetables from the garden, and occasional news from town. Her father had apparently retreated to the farm, but continued to make inquiries about her whereabouts. The sheriff, true to his word, had maintained that he had no knowledge of Elizabeth's location. A week into her stay, Elizabeth was sitting on the cabin's small porch, enjoying the sunset with a novel open on her lap, when Randall approached from the main house. Evening, he called, a smile warming his features. "Enjoying the book?" "Very much," she replied, marking her place. "Though I confess I'm having trouble concentrating today." "Something troubling you?" He took a seat on the step below her, removing his hat. Elizabeth hesitated, then admitted, "I feel useless. You've been so kind, providing food and shelter, and I've given nothing in return." Randall shook his head. "Your safety isn't conditional on your usefulness, Elizabeth. I understand that, but I've worked all my life. I'm not accustomed to idleness." She gestured toward the main house. "I could help with cooking, cleaning, mending." "You don't need to earn your right to be here," he interrupted gently. "It's not about earning my place," she tried to explain. "It's about feeling whole, having purpose." She met his gaze directly. "I'm grateful for this sanctuary, but I don't want to hide away forever. I want to build something new." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "I see. You're not looking for ways to repay me. You're looking for ways to reclaim yourself." "Yes," she said, relieved that he understood. "Exactly that." Randall considered for a moment, then nodded. "As it happens, Mrs. Holloway has been asking for help with the household management. She's getting on in years and finds the larger tasks challenging. Would that interest you?" "Very much," Elizabeth said eagerly. "Good. You can start tomorrow, if you like." He smiled at her enthusiasm. "And perhaps you might join me for dinner at the main house tonight? Mrs. Holloway made her famous beef stew, and I confess I'm tired of eating alone." The invitation surprised her. "You eat alone? What about your ranch hands?" "They take their meals in the bunkhouse." Traditional separation of rancher and hands. He shrugged. "Never much cared for the practice myself, but it's what they're comfortable with." Elizabeth found herself accepting before she'd fully considered the implications. Dining alone with Randall in his home was a far cry from their casual interactions thus far. Yet something about the prospect sent a pleasant flutter through her stomach. That evening, she dressed in her best and only dress, a simple blue cotton garment that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. She brushed her auburn hair until it shone, pinning it back in a simple style that her mother had taught her long ago. The main house was larger than it appeared from a distance, a solid two-story structure built of local timber with a wide wraparound porch. Inside, it was surprisingly homelike rather than imposing comfortable furniture, bookshelves lining the walls, and a cheerful fire in the stone hearth despite the summer evening. "This is lovely," Elizabeth said as Randall showed her to the dining room. "Have you lived here long?" "About a year," he replied, pulling out her chair. "The previous owner was retiring, and I'd been looking for a place of my own after managing my uncle's ranch in Wyoming." The table was set with care, not formally, but with obvious attention to detail. Mrs. Holloway, a round-faced woman with kind eyes, served the promised stew with fresh baked bread before discreetly withdrawing to the kitchen. "She doesn't live here?" Elizabeth asked, noticing the woman gathering her things to leave. "No, she has a small house in town. Her husband works at the mercantile." Randall served Elizabeth a generous portion of stew. "It's just me rattling around in this big place most evenings." As they ate, conversation flowed more easily than Elizabeth had anticipated. Randall told her about his years working his uncle's ranch, his decision to strike out on his own, and his hopes for expanding the Xavier property in the coming years. Elizabeth found herself sharing memories of her mother, her love of books, and even some of the dreams she'd harbored in secret, learning to paint, perhaps one day seeing the ocean. "San Francisco isn't so very far," Randall observed. "A week's journey by train and stage, at most." "It might as well be the moon," Elizabeth said with a small smile. "I've never been farther than 20 miles from Willow Creek." "That could change, if you wanted it to." His eyes met hers across the table, something unspoken passing between them. After dinner, they moved to the parlor, where Randall surprised her by revealing a small but elegant piano in the corner. "Do you play?" Elizabeth asked, running her fingers lightly over the keys. "Badly," he admitted with a laugh. "My mother insisted I learn as a boy, but I never had the patience for it." "Do you?" "My mother taught me." "It's been years, though." She pressed a key softly, the note hanging in the air between them. "Would you play something?" "Only if you'd like to," he added quickly. Elizabeth hesitated, then sat on the bench. Her fingers found the keys tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she played a simple melody her mother had taught her. The notes were sometimes imperfect, but the music filled the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. When she finished, she looked up to find Randall watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. There was admiration there, certainly, but something else too, something that made her cheeks warm and her pulse quicken. "Beautiful," he said simply. Whether he meant the music or something else, Elizabeth wasn't certain, but the moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. The spell was broken by the distant sound of the ranch hands returning from town, their voices carrying through the open window. Randall rose, offering his hand to help her from the piano bench. "I should walk you back to the cabin," he said. "It's getting late." Under the vast Montana sky, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet darkness, they walked slowly toward the cabin. Neither seemed eager for the evening to end. "Thank you for dinner," Elizabeth said as they reached her door. "And for everything." Randall stood close enough that she could see the way the moonlight caught in his eyes. "Elizabeth," whatever he might have said was interrupted by the urgent approach of one of his ranch hands. "Boss, sorry to interrupt, but there's trouble. Ryder just came from town. Granger's been making threats at the saloon, saying he's coming here tonight with some men to take his daughter back." Elizabeth's blood ran cold, and she instinctively stepped closer to Randall. "How many men?" Randall asked, his voice calm despite the news. "3 or 4, from what Jensen heard. All been drinking heavy." Randall nodded grimly. "Alert the others. I want men stationed around the property, but no one engages unless absolutely necessary. This doesn't need to end in bloodshed." As the ranch hand hurried away, Randall turned to Elizabeth. "You should stay in the main house tonight. It's more secure, and my men can watch it better." Fear clawed at her throat, threatening to overwhelm her. "This is my fault. I never should have brought this trouble to your door." "No." Randall's voice was firm as he took her hands in his. "None of this is your fault. The only person responsible is your father." His grip tightened slightly. "I won't let him hurt you again, Elizabeth. I promise you that." The conviction in his voice steadied her. "All right." They hurried back to the main house, where Randall quickly organized his men. 2 would guard the approaches to the ranch, 2 more would position themselves near the house, and the others would continue their normal duties but remain alert. Inside, Randall checked his rifle and pistol, placing them within easy reach but out of sight. He showed Elizabeth to a guest room upstairs, with windows that offered a clear view of the approaching road. "Try to get some rest," he suggested, though they both knew sleep would be impossible. "I'll be downstairs. You'll be safe." Left alone, Elizabeth paced the room, watching the road and listening for any sound of approaching riders. An hour passed, then another. The ranch remained quiet, the only movement coming from Randall's men as they changed positions or checked the perimeter. Just as exhaustion began to overcome her anxiety, the sound of distant hoofbeats broke the night's silence. Elizabeth moved to the window, peering into the darkness. 4 riders approached, moving slowly but purposefully toward the ranch house. Even from a distance, she recognized her father's distinctive slouch in the saddle. Heart pounding, she hurried downstairs to find Randall standing on the porch, watching the approaching riders with calm resolve. "Stay inside," he told her when he sensed her presence behind him. "I can't hide while you face danger because of me," she protested. Before he could argue, the riders pulled up in the yard, her father at their lead. Even in the dim light, Elizabeth could see he was in a dangerous state, drunk enough to be reckless, but not so intoxicated that he couldn't cause serious harm. "Xavier," Samuel Granger called, his voice slurring slightly. "I know she's here. Send out my daughter, or we'll come in and get her." Randall's men emerged from the shadows, rifles ready, but not aimed directly at the intruders. The show of force caused Samuel's companions to shift nervously, but her father remained belligerent. "This doesn't need to get ugly, Granger," Randall called back. "Go home. Sleep it off. We can talk tomorrow when you're sober. I'm not leaving without what's mine." Samuel dismounted unsteadily, reaching for his pistol. Elizabeth stepped onto the porch, ignoring Randall's attempt to keep her back. "Enough, father." Samuel's bloodshot eyes fixed on her, his expression a mixture of rage and triumph. "There you are, you ungrateful girl. Get down here now." "No." The word was simple but carried the weight of years of suppressed defiance. "I'm not going back. Not ever." "You little." He raised his pistol, the gesture wild and uncoordinated. Several things happened at once. Randall moved in front of Elizabeth, shielding her with his body. His men raised their rifles, and Sheriff Miller's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. "Drop that gun, Samuel. Now." Everyone turned to see the sheriff riding into the yard, accompanied by 2 deputies. He had his own pistol drawn and aimed squarely at Samuel Granger. "This isn't your business, Miller," Samuel snarled, though his gun hand wavered. "A man threatening violence on another man's property is exactly my business," the sheriff replied evenly. "Now put down that weapon before someone gets hurt." For a tense moment, it seemed Samuel might actually fire. Then, with a curse, he lowered his pistol. "Miss Granger," the sheriff called, addressing Elizabeth directly. "Are you here of your own free will?" Elizabeth stepped forward, standing tall despite her racing heart. "I am, Sheriff. I fled my father's abuse, and Mr. Xavier offered me sanctuary." "She's lying," Samuel protested. "She's my daughter. I have rights." "Not to beat her." "You don't." Sheriff Miller dismounted, approaching cautiously. "I've been making inquiries, Samuel. Seems quite a few folks in town have had suspicions over the years, but kept quiet out of respect for your grief. That ends tonight." He turned to one of his deputies. "Take Mr. Granger and his friends back to town. Lock them up until they sober up." To Samuel, he added, "We'll have a longer conversation tomorrow about the law regarding assault, even when it's family." As the deputies led the protesting men away, the sheriff approached the porch where Randall still stood protectively near Elizabeth. "Miss Granger, I owe you an apology," Sheriff Miller said, removing his hat. "I should have asked more questions long ago." Elizabeth nodded, unable to find words for the complex emotions swirling within her. "She'll need to come to town tomorrow to make a formal statement," the sheriff continued, addressing Randall. "But for tonight, I think she's where she needs to be." After the sheriff departed, the ranch gradually settled back into stillness. Randall's men returned to their posts or the bunkhouse, leaving him and Elizabeth alone on the porch. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Elizabeth realized she was trembling, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her system. "I think so. I've never stood up to him like that before." "You were brave," Randall said, genuine admiration in his voice. "I was terrified," she admitted. "But when I saw him threaten you." She looked up, meeting his gaze. "I couldn't let him hurt anyone else because of me." Something shifted in Randall's expression, then a softening, a certainty. He reached out, gently touching her cheek where the bruise had begun to fade. "Elizabeth." Whatever he meant to say was lost as she closed the distance between them, acting on impulse and emotion rather than thought. Their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened, his arms encircling her waist as hers found their way around his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Elizabeth felt a momentary flash of embarrassment at her boldness. But the look in Randall's eyes, tender, amazed, and unmistakably loving, banished any regret. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you hanging laundry in the sunshine," he confessed, his voice husky. Elizabeth smiled, a true, unfettered smile that reached her eyes. "Even with a bruised face and frightened eyes?" "Especially then," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Because even bruised and frightened, your strength showed through. I knew then that you were extraordinary." He kissed her again, more gently this time, and Elizabeth felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, not just desire or affection, but a sense of possibility, of a future unfolding before her that held promise rather than dread. "It's late," Randall said when they finally separated. "You should rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Elizabeth nodded, though the thought of returning to the empty guest room held little appeal after the intimacy they had just shared. As if reading her thoughts, Randall took her hand. "I'll be right downstairs if you need anything," he promised. "Anything at all." Sleep came easier than Elizabeth expected, her mind and body exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day. She dreamed not of her father's rage or her past fears, but of wide-open spaces, freedom, and Randall's blue eyes looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Morning brought clarity and a sense of purpose. As Elizabeth dressed for the journey into town, she studied her reflection in the mirror. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish shadow, and the woman who gazed back at her seemed different, somehow stronger, more certain of herself. Not fully healed, perhaps, but healing. Downstairs, she found Randall in conversation with Sheriff Miller, who had returned to escort them to town. Both men rose as she entered. "Miss Granger," the sheriff greeted her. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Ready," she replied simply. The ride to Willow Creek was quiet, each traveler lost in their own thoughts. Elizabeth found comfort in Randall's steady presence beside her, his horse keeping pace with hers as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The town looked much as it always had, the main street lined with familiar buildings, people going about their morning business. Yet Elizabeth saw it differently now, noticing how heads turned as they passed, conversations halting briefly before resuming in hurried whispers. News traveled fast in small towns, and the confrontation at the Xavier Ranch would be the talk of Willow Creek for weeks to come. At the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered, parting silently to let them pass. Inside, Elizabeth gave her statement, recounting years of abuse in a steady voice that only occasionally trembled. Sheriff Miller recorded her words carefully, asking clarifying questions, but never doubting her account. "Your father is still in custody," he informed her when she had finished. "Given the seriousness of these allegations and his behavior last night, the judge has authorized me to hold him until a formal hearing can be arranged." "What will happen to him?" Elizabeth asked, surprised to find she still cared. "That depends partly on you," the sheriff said. "If you wish to press charges, he could face significant jail time. If not," he shrugged, "still consequences, but less severe." Elizabeth looked to Randall, who had remained a supportive presence throughout her testimony. "What would you do?" "It's not my decision to make," he said gently. "But if you're asking my opinion, your father needs to face consequences for his actions. Not just for your sake, but for his own. Some men never change until they're forced to confront what they've become." His words echoed in her mind as she considered her options. "I want him to face justice," she finally said. "But I also want him to get help. The drinking, the rage. It wasn't always this way." Sheriff Miller nodded. "The judge can order treatment as part of any sentence. I'll make sure he knows your wishes." As they left the sheriff's office, Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders, not completely gone, but lighter than before. The future still held uncertainties, but for the first time, it also held hope. "Are you hungry?" Randall asked as they stepped into the sunlight. "The hotel serves a decent lunch." The prospect of appearing in public, of facing the townspeople's curiosity and judgment, made Elizabeth hesitate. Then she straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I think I'd like that." The hotel dining room fell briefly silent as they entered, all eyes turning toward them before conversations resumed with deliberate casualness. Randall led her to a table by the window, positioning himself so that his back was to the room, giving her some privacy from curious stares. As they waited for their meal, Elizabeth noticed a woman approaching their table, Mrs. Patterson, the preacher's wife, who had always been kind to her during church services. "Elizabeth, dear," the older woman said, her eyes warm with concern. "I just wanted to say, we should have known, should have seen." "I'm so sorry." Before Elizabeth could respond, Mrs. Patterson squeezed her hand briefly and returned to her table. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of acknowledgement and regret. Throughout the meal, other townspeople stopped by, some offering awkward but sincere apologies, others simply expressing relief that she was safe. By the time they finished eating, Elizabeth felt a curious sense of reconciliation with a community that had failed to protect her, but now seemed genuinely remorseful for that failure. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Elizabeth caught sight of a familiar figure across the street, Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper from Randall's ranch. The woman waved enthusiastically, then crossed to join them. "Miss Granger, Mr. Xavier, just the people I was hoping to find." She beamed at them. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding help at the main house. If you're still interested, I believe we could start tomorrow." The normalcy of the offer, a job, a purpose, touched Elizabeth deeply. "I would like that very much, Mrs. Holloway." "Wonderful. 8 o'clock sharp, then. We'll start with inventory of the linens and pantry." With a cheerful nod, she bustled away. Randall chuckled as they watched her go. Mrs. Holloway has a way of making even the most dramatic situations seem entirely ordinary. "It's refreshing," Elizabeth admitted. To be treated as a person with skills to offer, not just a victim. His expression sobered. You're so much more than what happened to you, Elizabeth. I hope you know that. The ride back to the ranch seemed shorter somehow, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rolling landscape. Elizabeth found herself noticing details she had missed before: wildflowers dotting the grassland, the distant silhouette of mountains against the sky, the way Randall's profile looked against the backdrop of endless Montana sky. At the cabin, Randall helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Would you like to rest? It's been an exhausting day. Actually, I'd like to talk, if you don't mind. Elizabeth gestured toward the cabin porch. About last night. About us. They sat side by side on the porch steps, the late afternoon sunlight bathing everything in golden warmth. For a moment, neither spoke, content to simply exist in the peaceful silence. I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you, Randall finally said, his voice low and sincere. I know it's sudden. I know you're still healing. But I want you to know that what happened between us last night wasn't just impulse or relief after danger passed. Elizabeth turned to face him, studying the earnest blue eyes that had shown her nothing but kindness since the moment they met. What do you feel, Randall? Love, he said simply. I love your courage, your gentleness, your resilience. I love the way you see beauty in small things, how you play the piano as if you're having a conversation with the music, how you stand tall even when you're afraid. He took her hand, his touch reverent. I love you, Elizabeth Granger, and I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes, but they were different from any she had shed before, not tears of pain or fear, but of a joy so overwhelming it couldn't be contained. How can you be so certain? We've known each other such a short time. Some things you just know, he said, brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. I knew the moment I saw those bruises and felt such rage that anyone would hurt you. I knew when you stood on my porch in the moonlight, frightened but determined to forge your own path. I knew when you faced your father without flinching. His voice grew softer. And I knew beyond any doubt when you kissed me last night, and it felt like coming home. Elizabeth's heart swelled with emotion she had never dared to imagine she might feel. I love you too, she whispered, the words new and wonderful on her tongue. I love your kindness, your steadfastness, the way you see me, really see me. Not as something broken to be fixed, but as someone worthy of respect and love. Randall's smile was radiant as he leaned forward to kiss her, a gentle meeting of lips that held promise of 1,000 more such moments to come. I don't want to rush you, he said when they parted. You've had no chance to discover who you are apart from your father's control. If you need time, Elizabeth pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. I've had a lifetime of waiting, Randall. A lifetime of dreams deferred and hopes crushed. I don't want to wait anymore. Not for this. Not for us. In the days that followed, Elizabeth divided her time between working alongside Mrs. Holloway at the main house and making the small cabin truly her own. She planted flowers by the door, hung curtains at the windows, and began to fill the shelves with books Randall brought her from town. Word came that her father had been sentenced to 6 months in the county jail, with mandatory treatment for his drinking. Elizabeth had chosen not to attend the hearing, but Sheriff Miller assured her that the judge had been fair but firm. Upon his release, Samuel Granger would be prohibited from approaching her and required to continue treatment. With that chapter of her life closed, if not fully healed, Elizabeth turned her attention to the future. Each day brought new discoveries about the ranch, about Randall, about herself. She found she had a talent for organization that Mrs. Holloway praised effusively. She learned to ride properly, Randall teaching her with infinite patience. She even began to experiment with painting, using supplies he surprised her with one evening. Their courtship progressed with a beautiful simplicity. Dinners in the main house, picnics by the creek, long rides across the ranch land. Kisses that grew more passionate as their connection deepened. Conversations that lasted into the night, sharing dreams and fears, hopes and memories. Through it all, Randall never pressured, never rushed. He seemed content to let their relationship unfold at its own pace, savoring each new facet of intimacy as it developed naturally between them. One crisp autumn evening, As golden leaves drifted down around them during a walk along the creek, Randall stopped beneath a towering cottonwood tree. Taking both her hands in his, he looked into her eyes with such tenderness it made her breath catch. "Elizabeth Granger," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his expression, "I know we haven't known each other long by most standards, but I've loved you from the moment I saw you, and that love has only grown stronger each day. You are the bravest, most beautiful soul I've ever known, and I want nothing more than to spend the rest of my life by your side." He knelt before her, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. "Will you marry me?" The ring inside was simple but elegant, a sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Elizabeth's heart soared as she looked down at this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, not as a damsel in a fairy tale, but as a partner who had given her the safety and support to save herself. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Randall Xavier." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms, kissing her with a joy that matched her own. When they finally separated, both breathless and laughing, he pressed his forehead to hers. "No more bruises," he whispered, echoing the promise he had made that moonlit night that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. "Only love for all our days." They were married on a perfect spring morning, with wildflowers carpeting the ranch land and the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. The entire town of Willow Creek attended, the community that had once looked away now embracing Elizabeth as one of their own. Mrs. Holloway had outdone herself with the wedding feast, and the celebration continued well into the evening. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Randall led his bride away from the festivities toward the main house, their house now, their home. On the porch, he paused, lifting her into his arms with a smile that made her heart race. "Welcome home, Mrs. Xavier." Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his neck, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in less than a year. From fear to freedom, from isolation to belonging, from bruises to the tender touch of a man who cherished her. "Home," she repeated, the word filled with meaning it had never held before. Not a place to hide or endure, but a sanctuary they had built together, a foundation for the future they would share. As Randall carried her across the threshold into their new life, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of her story were just beginning. There would be challenges ahead. Of course, life on the frontier ensured that, but they would face them together, with the strength and resilience they had found in each other. 5 years later, Elizabeth stood on that same porch, watching as Randall taught their 3-year-old daughter Catherine to ride her first pony. The little girl's laughter carried across the yard, bright and fearless, so different from Elizabeth's own childhood. Beside her, nestled in a cradle, their 6-month-old son James slept peacefully, his tiny features a perfect blend of his parents. Elizabeth rested her hand on the cradle, gently rocking it as she drank in the scene before her. The Xavier Ranch had prospered under their joint care. The main house had expanded to accommodate their growing family. The gardens Elizabeth had planted now flourished, providing vegetables for their table and flowers for every room. Randall's careful management had increased the herd, making them one of the most successful operations in the territory. But their greatest achievement, Elizabeth knew, was the home they had created, not the physical structure, but the love that filled it. A place where voices were never raised in anger, where mistakes were met with patience rather than punishment, where each person was valued for exactly who they were. Randall looked up, catching her eye across the yard. The love in his gaze was as strong as it had been the day they met, perhaps even stronger for all they had built together. "Mama, look," Catherine called, sitting proudly atop her pony. "I'm riding all by myself." "I see you, sweetheart," Elizabeth called back. "You're doing wonderfully." As she watched her daughter's confidence, her son's peaceful slumber, her husband's gentle guidance, Elizabeth felt a profound gratitude wash over her. For the courage that had allowed her to flee that night, for the kindness of a stranger who had become her everything, for the twist of fate that had brought Randall to her father's farm that summer day. "No more bruises," she whispered to herself, the promise now a reality that extended to a new generation. The cycle of fear and pain had been broken, replaced by a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the mountains, but Elizabeth wasn't worried. They had weathered storms before and would again. What mattered was that they faced them together not as a frightened girl and her rescuer, but as equal partners in the life they had chosen. Randall led Catherine and her pony toward the porch as the first drops of rain began to fall. His smile as he approached held all the warmth and tenderness that had become the cornerstone of Elizabeth's world. "I think that's enough riding for today," he said, lifting Catherine from the saddle. "How about we all go inside for some of Mama's apple pie?" "Yes, please." Catherine clapped her hands excitedly. As they gathered their children and stepped into the warmth of their home, the rain began to fall in earnest outside. But inside, surrounded by the family they had created, Elizabeth and Randall shared a look that said everything words could not: gratitude for the path that had brought them together, joy in the present they shared, and hope for all the tomorrows stretching before them. The bruises of Elizabeth's past had faded completely, replaced by the gentle touches of a man who had taught her what love truly meant. And in that love, she had found not just safety, but the courage to become the woman she was always meant to be: strong, loving, and finally, completely free.